Wait for you fucking name. The joke now. I know what I'm good at. Only I want let me. Sorry, just
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, I'm no qua Osinachi. One man Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama Osinachi. Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, I'm no qua Osinachi. One man Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama Osinachi. kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One money, Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. I think we're
Okay, hi everyone. Please, we're going to give it extra 5 minutes to wait for the share. After 5 minutes, please, anyone who start sharing the panel, any the time you'll come. Thank you.
sure, no problem.
Are we allowed to share screen?
I think we should be able to. I know in the other sessions, people have been able to share screen. So we've got
all panelists share screen. You can share your screen. Please just explore the options you have on your screen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with
Comment. Hey, where did you go? Huh? Where were you? Your daddy is not here. What's your daddy's name? Yes, what is his name? Adeyemi. Why is he not here? This is his panel. You call him, yes. He's sharing a panel now. Awulo, right? Adeyemadigoju, right? Can you help us call him to say, I mean, we are waiting for him now. Yes, now. Wait, we are waiting for him. And they will start the panel. He's a chair. And he has 1 minute to log in now because I told them to wait 5 minutes. Yes.
Hi, it still looks like we have no chair, so are you happy for us to get going? Our hosts, is that okay? I think it probably makes sense for us just to, if that's okay, I hope, I don't know, yeah, shall we make a start? Okay. Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so we've heard from our host as well. We can start. Thank you. I guess, guys, if we just introduce ourselves when we start speaking, maybe, and we'll see whether Wendy turns up as well. Should we just go in the order that we're in the program? Is that, yeah, okay. So I'll start then. So hi everybody, lovely to be here. Thank you for joining us. So my name is Catherine Baxter. I'm Professor of English Literature at Northumbria University in the UK. And I'm going to be speaking this evening or afternoon or morning, depending on where you're tuning in from, about a comic strip essentially called Shango and Musa, which appeared in the Daily Times in the 1960s. And I'm going to try to share my screen. Let me see if this will work. Okay, share, okay. Are people seeing my screen now? Is that working? Okay, great, thank you. I can see your nods. So I'm going to try and do slideshows from the start as well. Sorry, my computer's quite slow, but hopefully, okay, right. So I shall get going. So this is the title of my talk, and I shall make a start. So on Saturday, the 15th of December, 1962, several items jostle for the reader's attention on the front cover of Nigeria's Daily Times newspaper. The headline news story predicts the imminent return of the Western region of Chief Akintola. Beneath this comes the latest report from the treasonable felony trial of Awolowo and other Action Group members. Taking up almost as much space on the page as the Akintola story is a revealing picture of a young woman who, as the caption explains, knows what it takes to turn heads. And pressing in on the Akintola story from the other side is a large advertisement for gin. But above all these, and lent prominence not only by its position, but also by its negative print, white on colour, is the declaration, Musa Shango, a new all-Nigerian strip cartoon, begins today on page 10. So I want to take a bit of time today to introduce you to this comic strip and to share some of my first reflections about it, at what is very much the start of my research into this comic. Yeah, emphasis on start. I've got a lot more work to do on this. So the comic strip was drawn by Oregaba Opako, and it appeared from December 1962 through to March 1965. And it serialized Cyprian Ekwensi's 1954 novel, The People of the City. The comic takes its title from the novel's central character, Musa Shango, who is a journalist and a musician. Ekwensi's episodic novel traces the highs and lows of city life in late colonial Nigeria, told through the lens of Shango's professional and romantic entanglements. And the episodic nature of Ekwensi's novel lends itself well to serialization, and the comic makes the most of this. So, to begin with, the comic was published 3 times a week on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday. Quite quickly, however, the comic's appearance became a little less regular, appearing more commonly twice and latterly once a week on Saturdays, usually in the Daily Times' centre pull-out page, the Saturday High Life, and this is an example of that Saturday High Life page. The comic tended to comprise 3 or 4 panels, often with an additional caption panel. Its regular position at the bottom of the centre page, as we see it here, allowed printing across the sheet without a break in the image because it was on the centrefold. And this gave Apoko considerable freedom to split the panels differently from strip to strip. Compared to other comic strips serialised at the same time in the Daily Times, such as Garth and Buck Ryan, which we can see here on the right-hand image, up on the right-hand side above the Mealtime Delights. Amuja Tango was given rather more space. It's a larger cartoon on the page than Garth or Buck Ryan. And this fact, combined with the comic's often heavy use of Akwenzi's text in caption panels, gave it a different aesthetic to the British syndicate, to these other British syndications. So in Amusa Sango, speech bubbles, for example, quite frequently escape their frame and intrude onto the text. And Aparco's panels also oscillate between discontextualized images such as floating heads, which I'll show you in a little bit, and detailed images of streets and crowded scenes. And this stylistic oscillation contrasts with more consistent layout that we find in British comics that the Daily Times carried. The variety that we find in Aparco's strips also seems to reflect him exploring stylistic devices. So early in the series, he makes use of sound effects. I'm really sorry that these are slightly blurry. They're from sort of images taken from microfiche, and the images just aren't brilliant. But you get a sense here of sound effects that are being used. But their use falls by the wayside as the narrative develops. Later on, for example, the sound of mourning is signalled by a speech bubble, rather than the earlier sound effects used to signal angry voices in the street that we see below. Similarly, floating heads like these ones appear in multiple strips in September and October 1964, but are never quite this stylized before or after this period. So just in this kind of couple of months, Aparco introduces them in a very particular way and uses them really commonly. Aparco's experimentation signals the ambition of the comic to break new ground. On the Wednesday before the first instalment, the Daily Times ran a front page announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we take another great step forward today. We introduce a new strip cartoon to our readers. We are proud of this achievement because this is the first time that a Nigerian strip cartoon based on a Nigerian story by a Nigerian author and drawn by a Nigerian artist will be published by a Nigerian newspaper. The man who brings the thrill of Cyprian Akwenzi's writing and the delight of a luscious romance to you in cartoon strip is the brilliant young artist Origabo Aparco, Daily Times staff man. Shango and Aina will become household names. Keep right up with them from the very start. Watch out for further announcements in the Daily Times this week. I haven't been able to verify the Daily Times claim, but certainly this is the only newspaper comic strip that I found from this period drawn by a Nigerian artist. There are lots of other comics or kind of cartoons being drawn in this period, but not this kind of comic strip form. Moreover, the decision to adapt a novel is an unusual one rather than to come up with a new story. The two other major British comics that the Daily Times carried at this time were created for the British newspaper, the Daily Mirror. And both the Mirror and the Times were owned by the Daily Mirror Group, who had expanded into West African newspapers at the end of the Second World War. So that common ownership is, I think, the explanation for why Garth and Buck Ryan appeared in the Daily Times. But Garth and Buck Ryan were created as original comics. They weren't adaptations, and they were clearly modelled on American paradigms. Garth is an action-adventure narrative whose eponymous time-travelling hero has nearly superhuman powers. Buck Ryan is a crime-fighting detective in the Dick Tracy mould. As the Daily Times announcement indicates, the ambition of Amusa Sango was to offer something different, a specifically Nigerian comic whose thrills and luscious romances could rival the drama of these British strips. But in offering a Nigerian alternative, the Daily Times rejected the American model of action heroes and detectives, and instead it turned to a Nigerian novel that focuses resolutely on everyday life. This choice reflects the Daily Times' ethos in the period. It was nationalist in outlook, but not financially aligned at this point with any of the major political parties. And that was partly because of its ownership by the Mirror Group. The Daily Times gave prominence to human interest stories and photo illustration. Akwenzi's novel, with its focus on romance and city life, fitted effectively into the Daily Times' kind of style and ethos. And being able to involve Akwenzi himself in the paper provided considerable kudos. A week after the serialization began, the Saturday Highlights leading article featured photos of and brief interviews with Apako and Akwenzi. The article takes every opportunity to underline the originality and Nigerianness of the comic in ways that align it to its production with the Daily Times' larger commitment to telling stories about Nigeria's development and modernity. Akwenzi is introduced as a top Nigerian author with many novels to his credit. And he's quoted as saying, "I'm glad that the Daily Times has taken this new step forward in Nigerian journalism." And Apako is presented as largely self-taught and leading the way in a new Nigerian field. Indeed, the Times' decision to run the comic is also, I think, noteworthy in relationship to newspaper cartooning and comic culture in Nigeria at this time more broadly. While Nigerian drawn strip comics were rare, cartooning, that is to say single or multi-panel cartoons that presented humour and or commentary as opposed to a serialised narrative, were prevalent. And scholarship on Nigerian cartooning has tended to focus almost exclusively on this other mode. There's excellent work done, and we had a really fantastic panel all about this earlier today. This scholarship has examined the formal features and types of Nigerian cartooning, and also how it mediates and mediated politics, social concerns, and literary aesthetics. But intriguingly, there's almost no mention of Apako's early strip comics in the scholarship. Oleniyan, for example, suggests the first two significant practitioners didn't appear until the 1970s. But Apako's project to adapt People of the City was clearly sort of part of a larger project that the Daily Times ran. It ran the strip cartoon itself ran for over 2 years. And Apako and Akwenzi almost immediately began to serialise Akwenzi's novel Jaguar Nana in the Daily Times' spin-off lifestyle periodical Spear, Nigeria's national magazine. As Ganiyo Akinloye Jimoh has argued, the Daily Times showed little interest in this period in political cartooning, and this was in line with its relatively politically neutral stance. Unlike those papers that were aligned to particular political parties, we only find occasionally single panel cartoons in the pages of the Times during which Amusa Shango was serialised. So on Saturday, the 20th of July, 1963, the Times looked like it was about to buck this trend with a front page cartoon and a notice that read, "This for a start. Well, here we go. The Daily Times cartoonist kicks off today with this one. Follow him every Saturday as he caricatures current events." However, the initiative was short-lived, and I found very few other cartoons of this kind in the Saturday issues of the Daily Times. But if the scope of editorially elicited cartooning and comics was limited in the Daily Times, it doesn't mean that it didn't have such content. Another aspect of Nigerian cartooning in this period that has tended to go unmentioned in the use of cartoons and the comic strip format, and that's in advertising. So these advertisements filled the pages of the Daily Times, and unlike Garth and Buck Ryan, they narrated stories that were distinctly Nigerian. So while Shango Amusa might have been one of the first editorially commissioned comics to appear in the daily press, it was accompanied by many others that were published in service to the various products that they advertised. Products that were advertised via comics included everything from Marmite to BP and the Mr. Beep, the taxi on the right-hand side. There was a whole kind of series of different stories that were told about Mr. Beep using strip, this kind of comic strip form. And sorry again, I apologise, this is so blurry, but I'll describe it to you a little bit. So Phosphorine ran this advertisement quite regularly. The narrative shows how taking phosphorine helps small boy Peter become big and strong, to the extent, it's a really far-fetched story, that when a baby is drowning at sea, he leaps in and saves it and thus wins the heart of the girl of his dreams. Similarly, oh, sorry, let me see if I can go back. I've skipped a slide. There we go, okay. So the advertisement on the left here by Mentholatum tells the story of a man who cures his barber's rash with the balm and consequently wins his girl. And Fenzik went one further and ran a series of different comics advertising the same headache cure. So here, for example, an anxious beauty queen contestant is revived by Fenzik and goes on to win the crown. And there were all kinds of different stories that Fenzik told about people about to kind of bottle it essentially, and then they take Fenzik and everything goes brilliantly. So what's interesting here is that while the artistry of these commercial comics is less experimental than Apaco's, and while the stories are more self-contained, there are no cliffhangers, these commercials tell stories about the challenges of love for young people that echo in tame forms the episodes of Amusa Shango. These commercial comics understandably steer away from the harsher realities in which the novel and its adaptation deal, but nonetheless all of them focus on romance as a key arena for success in life. This similarity is all the more emphatic because of the excisions that the comics adaptation made to sections of people of the city that focus on political topics. So here is where we encounter Shango's assignment to the Eastern Greens. So in the novel, he's assigned there and covers the violent suppression of a miners' strike. But here it's reduced to a single panel. And this is the bit on the left that's so blurry. I'll read it out. It says, Shango flew out of Lagos to cover the coal crisis in eastern Nigeria. He spent 2 weeks there, and on his return, Bayo came to see him, where he put up in First Trumpeter's room. So the whole politics of the Eastern Greens episode in the novel is removed. So the decision not to represent the strike might have been made partly because of the challenge in representing this episode in the book visually, but the episode may also have been too political for editorial policy governing content in the Daily Times. The second major episode that doesn't seem to be included is Shango's dismissal from his post as a journalist when he writes an article about racial tensions between Nigerians and the Lebanese following the murder of his friend Bayo and Bayo's Lebanese girlfriend Swad by Swad's brother. What's a little mysterious here is it does appear that Apako may have created comic strips for this episode, but they don't seem to have been included. So the reason I think this is because each comic is numbered sequentially, so each strip has its own number. And the comic that depicts Bayo and Suad's murder, which is this one, is numbered 111, and it appeared on the 12th of December in 1964. The next strip that I've been able to find, it doesn't appear until the 30th of January in 1965, and it shows Shango meeting the mother of his soon-to-be bride, and that comic is numbered 116. So there are several explanations as to the whereabouts of the 4 intervening comics. The first and most likely explanation is that I just haven't found them when I've been scanning these issues. I've yet to recheck the microfilms, and they're held down in London and I live quite a long way away, so I haven't been able to go back and look again. So I think human error is probably the most likely explanation. But given the very limited action that each comic strip contains, material has clearly been dropped in those 4 missing strips, whether I find them or not, since more happens in the novel than could reasonably be covered in 4 comics. My suspicion is that this might be Shango's dismissal, or that this episode, like the Eastern Greens, might be reduced to a single text panel to avoid creating a dissonance between the liberal ethos that the Daily Times sought to cultivate and the more complicated implications of censorship that are at play in Akwenzi's novel. more research is clearly necessary on my part. So I'm going to draw to a conclusion there, really. And what I hope I've been able to give you a taster of today is not just the originality of this comic, both in its ambition and its artistic execution, but it's also what I hope is that to prompt a reconsideration of the broader uses and context of cartooning in Nigeria's press in the 1960s, which extended beyond the overtly political and humorous body of work that has so far attracted scholarship. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen. I'm trying to work out how to do that. Hang on a second, I'll see if I can work it out. Let's see. I'm really sorry. I'm trying to work out how I return to the oh, here we go, stop sharing. There we go. There's a big thing that actually says stop sharing that I just hadn't seen. Thank you.
Yeah, the chair is still not here, right? I guess. So I think I'm the second on the list, so I'll just go next, right? So my name is Hope, a graduate student at the University of Alberta in Canada. And I want to present a portion of, it's one portion of a paper that I've already published. So, and the title is Neither Here Nor There, Investigating Trauma in Tsitsi Dangareba's Nervous Conditions. Nervous conditions is a novel. Tsitsi Dangareba is a Zimbabwean. And I wrote a paper on her novel, Nervous Conditions. So I'll just start. In her seminal book, Unclaimed Experience, Kathy Caruth, following Freud, defines trauma as a wound inflicted not upon the body, but upon the mind. In her words, quote, "But the wound of the mind, the breach in the mind's experience of time, self, and the world is not, like the wound of the body, a simple and healable event, but rather an event that is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known, and is therefore not available to the consciousness until it imposes itself again repeatedly in the nightmares and repetitive actions of the survivor." Throughout this paper, where she says that the wound is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known is at the crux of this paper. So this definition, among others, launched the field of trauma theory in literary studies and has since come under serious scrutiny and criticism. Among the major opponents of Caruth's model of conceptualizing trauma are post-colonial critics, such as Irene Visser, who attack Caruth's theory because of its, quote, Eurocentric event-based conception of trauma, its too narrow focus on Freudian psychoanalysis, and its deconstructionist approach that closes off other approaches to literary trauma, unquote. For others like Steph Krabs, Caruth's theory does not account for the sustained and long processes of the trauma of colonization, slavery, and other culture-specific forms of violence that have been recorded in human history. Elaborating on trauma theory, Caruth further states that trauma itself may provide the link between cultures. This is also another crucial point. She says trauma itself might provide the link between cultures. And it is this statement that many post-colonial critics of her model have held on to, arguing that while trauma, I'm quoting Visser, while trauma theory has undoubtedly yielded numerous insights into the relationship between psychic suffering and cultural representation, it has not fulfilled its promise of cross-cultural engagement, unquote. Now, discarding Caruth's model of theorizing trauma, Sonia Andema, quoting Steph Krabs, posits that if the ethical aspirations of the field are to be realized, there is an urgent need to decolonize trauma studies by recognizing the globalized context of traumatic events, the specific forms traumatic sufferings take, and the myriad ways in which it is represented in literary works. So, and it is against this backdrop that I am analyzing this novel, Nevo's Condition, as a site of post-colonial trauma. In response to Carroll's model and the agitations of post-colonial theories, I argued that the Eurocentric, psychoanalytic, and the constructionist model of trauma does not necessarily need to be discarded in order to accommodate the trauma of non-Western cultures. This is because there is no clear-cut distinction between trauma in Europe and North America. So, trauma in Europe and North America and trauma in other non-metropolitan contexts. As I'm going to show how this is true in this text I'm analyzing. So consequently, there is no need for as Zapata quote writes, there is no need for competition and hierarchies within traumatic histories and trauma theory. So on that note, I am arguing for cooperation instead of competition or hierarchies. Competition overlooks the fact that sufferings intersect and it causes distraction from the main concern, which should be identifying ways to heal from trauma. So if we are more concerned about trauma in Europe or trauma in Africa or trauma, everybody wants to define their own trauma, then as humans, we are losing sight of what we should be looking about. That's trauma and how to go about healing from trauma. So trauma should be regarded as a human condition and its various manifestations accounted for. In this novel, the characters Tambudzai, and she's the narrator as well, and her cousin, Yasha, will be the focal point of my analysis. I'll just give a bit background into the novel. Nevo's Conditions is set in the late 1960s Southern Rhodesia, which is present-day Zimbabwe, right after the unilateral declaration of independence from British rule by the white minority government in the then Southern Rhodesia. The plot revolves around the narrator Tambudzai, and her family call her Tambu for short, so I'll be calling her Tambu subsequently. The plot revolves around the narrator Tambudzai and her family, showing how they are all grappling with the devastating effects of colonization. Tambu's immediate family, or Tambu and her parents and siblings live in a homestead in their town called Umtali, while Baba Mukuru, her British-educated uncle, and her cousin Yasha's father, and the other members of their family live across at a missionary school across the Umtali town. I consider these two settings symbolic of the traditional values of the Umtali people prior to colonization and their encounter with British rule values, respectively. So the Umtali town where Tambu and her family live, I consider that I consider it symbolic of their Umtali cultural values. And then the mission, I consider symbolic of British values. And this is, okay, we'll see how this plays out, why I consider this, I consider them both ways. So the benevolent Baba Mukuru, on his return from England with his family, invites eligible members of the extended family to the missionary school to receive British education. And as soon as any member of the family leaves the homestead at Umtali for the mission, they become disgusted with their own culture while embracing British values. So this is why I consider them what I've explained earlier, sorry. So Tambu's elder brother, Nhamo, is the first to go to the mission, and within 1 year of studying at the mission, he, quotes, forgets how to speak Shona, his local language. So he eventually dies, and necessitated by his death, Tambu, his younger brother, becomes the next to go to the mission. And just like her brother, she also gradually begins to drift away from her cultural values to the ways of the colonizers. Then the character whose identity crisis is most prominent is Yasha, Tambu's cousin. Having spent part of her childhood in England, she returns with her family to realize that she has assumed a hybrid identity, which fits into neither the Umtali culture nor the English culture. The extended family is in a constant state of chaos from the beginning of the novel to the end. And I'll begin my analysis by looking at hybridization or in-betweenness as a colonial condition. One of the many devastating effects of colonization, as seen in this novel, is that those who have come in very close contact with the ways of the colonizers have difficulty living with dual identities. They are no longer fully African, neither are they fully English. They are trapped in between as hybrids, a situation that the natives of Umtali, who consider hybridization a curse, find offensive. Tambo cannot fully become like the colonizers, even after going to the mission school. She's trapped in between, just like her cousin Nyasha, who is a hybrid of the African and the English. The difference between them being that while Tambo is fascinated with Europeanness or Englishness, Nyasha has begun her process of emancipation through knowledge from history books. Although Nyasha is fully aware of her trauma, she's also entrapped as much as every other member of her family. She constantly questions the decision of her parents to take her and her brother to England. But moving to England was a necessity for her father, who could not disobey the colonizers' instruction to move. On her return from England, Nyasha is no longer acceptable to her peers. This situation poses alienation as a resulting effect of hybridization. The more Nyasha tries to find her way back home, the more home pushes her away. And at some point, she begins to loathe herself. This self-loathing begins at the point when she realizes that no matter how hard she tries, she cannot become African the way she used to be before England happened. In a letter, Nyasha writes to Tambo, she confesses, quote, "I find it more difficult to speak with the girls at school. I try, Tambo, but there is not much to speak of between us. They do not like my language, my English because it is authentic, and my Shona because it is not. I know I should not complain, but I very much would like to belong, Tambo, but I find that I do not." What is particularly interesting in Nyasha's situation, which is different from that of other members of her family, is her inquisitiveness, her curiosity to know more about her history, the history of the colonizers and the histories of other cultures and countries across the world. Tambo calls this Nyasha's historical phase. In Tambo's words, Nyasha was going through a historical phase. She read a lot of books that were about real people and their sufferings. She read about Arabs and the East Coast, and the British and the West, about Nazis and Japanese and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She had nightmares about these things, the atrocities, but she carried on reading all the same because she said you had to know the facts if you were ever going to find solutions. She wanted to know many things, whether the Jews' claim to Palestine was valid, whether monarchy was a just form of government, the nature of life and relations before colonization, exactly why UDI, that's the Universal Declaration of Independence, was declared and what it meant, unquote. And the more Nyasha delves deeper into these histories, the more intensely her psychic wound is triggered and the more her mental health deteriorates. The knowledge of this historical violence engulfs her in a way the Caruthian model of trauma cannot fully account for. And this is because Nyasha's trauma is not a single event, like Caruth defines, but it has the same lasting traumatic effect. In this context of trauma, Nyasha cannot be seen as a survivor either, because Caruth also used the word survivor. But Nyasha cannot be seen as a survivor. She's a victim. Her trauma is still eating deep into her, and she cannot help herself. And she's not a survivor because it is not an event that happened and ended. It is continuous. It is still happening to her. Colonization, even though we say post-colonialism or post-colonization, it's happened and it's something that cannot be undone. So that trauma is not a single event. So this does not go down well with Caruth's chronological model of events and post-events. Neither does it agree with her position of trauma as unknowable. Yes, that's another point. She says that trauma is unknowable, but Nyasha knows her trauma. In fact, the more she knows, the worse her situation becomes. But she's not giving up. She wants to confront colonization in a way no other member of her family does. And the more she does, the more she reveals what Frantz Fanon in his The Wretched of the Earth calls the colonized personality. In his words, quote, the defensive position born of this violent confrontation between the colonized and the colonialists constitutes a structure which then reveals the colonized personality. In order to understand this sensibility, we need only to study and appreciate the scope and depth of the wounds inflicted on the colonized during a single day under a colonial regime. That's Fanon. And having gone beyond the study of the wounds inflicted on a single day to the study of histories of colonization and other forms of cultural violence, Nyasha's situation becomes very intensified. Eventually, she becomes unable to contain her trauma as it engulfs her completely. When Tambu, her cousin, returns to the mission on holiday after leaving for secondary school elsewhere, Nyasha, confiding in her, says, "Do you see what they have done? They have taken us away. They have deprived you of you, him of him, ourselves of each other. We are groveling." Then, tearing her history books, she tears her history book into shreds. She continues screaming, "Their history, their bloody lies. They've trapped us, but I won't be trapped. I won't be trapped. Look what they have done to us. I am not one of them, but I am not one of you. I am not one of them, but I am not one of you." Unquote. It is one thing to suffer colonial violence. It is another thing to understand the weight of such suffering, and Nyasha understands it. So through revisiting the past and interrogating the present, Nyasha becomes unable to contain the weight of her suffering. Her family eventually decides to seek professional help, but the English psychiatrist who they take Nyasha to invalidates her trauma because, according to him, Africans do not suffer trauma. Tambu reports what he says. She says the psychiatrist said that Nyasha could not be ill, that Africans did not suffer in the way we had described. He said that she was making a scene, that we should take her home and be firm with her, unquote. The failure of the English psychiatrist to understand Nyasha's trauma reflects the failure of the Eurocentric model of trauma to contain the cultural trauma of non-Western cultures inflicted upon them through systemic violence. The exclusive Eurocentric model disregards any kind of suffering that is outside the limits of its narrow definition of trauma as an event that is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known. The psychiatrist does not understand postcolonial trauma, and for him, if he does not understand it, it does not exist. Furthermore, from the psychiatrist's Eurocentric point of view, trauma is exclusively a Western condition. Africans do not experience trauma. However, Nyasha demonstrates the inadequacy of this Eurocentric model. As I pointed out earlier, trauma is a human condition. There is no clear-cut distinction between Western trauma and the trauma of non-Western group, but the English psychiatrist is not able to identify this because he's working with a model of trauma that is boxed up in Western norms. This inability of the European model to understand Nyasha's trauma is the reason some post-colonial critics want to discard Carroll's definition and go for a theory that acknowledges historical and cultural specificities, a theory that will accommodate this kind of trauma. But as I posited earlier, Carroll's model does not have to be discarded because even though Nyasha's trauma is not a single unexpected event, it resonates with the part of Carroll's definition that understands trauma as a wound of the mind. In conclusion, having seen that the representations of trauma in this novel and the inadequacy of Carroll's Eurocentric model to contain the nature of violence specific to the colonial experience, it is pertinent that in order to realize the ethical aspirations of trauma, we need a theory that is culturally inclusive. That is not to say, however, that Carroll's theory should be discarded, as some post-colonial critics have suggested, considering that her theory captures some vital aspects of post-colonial trauma, as has been seen in this novel. Aspiring towards a post-colonial trauma theory that does not contain the experiences of metropolitan cultures will amount to the repetition of a vicious cycle. Since, according to Michael Rothberg, quote, "It is the domain of literature to present, represent, and dramatize in its many manifestations without making claims to precise definitions or complete exactitude," unquote. Trauma theories of both Western and non-Western cultures should be open to a more diversified and overlapping approach towards the conceptualization of trauma in literary studies. They should be open to cooperation, not competition. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, so I just launched in. Okay, I will share my screen. Hopefully I can do that without incident. Okay, you can see my screen, right? All right. So I am very excited to be in this panel, to be in conversation with scholars who are, working through African literature and cultural studies in very innovative ways. My name is Utarofon Ian, and I am a PhD student at University of California, Riverside. And this paper is part of an aspect of my dissertation in which I am generally trying to walk through the idea of, I think I should do slideshow. That's better. So I'm walking through the idea of movements, mobilities, kindnesses as animating principles that provide an alternative way of thinking through and thinking about African cultural productions in ways that foreground the indigenous. I was excited to see how this fits in with what Hope was presenting in her paper, the call for theoretical positions that exceed the boundaries of Eurocentrism to say, how does specific African experiences have a way of nuancing, these kinds of discourse differently. So in this paper, the leg knows every letter, kinesthetic politics in Simon Forti's Huddle, and Neo Sundare's Horses of Memory. What I tried to do is to put these two pieces in conversation, because my field of studies is comparative literature, and it's always interesting to see what happens when texts from different contexts that seem to have similar animating principles are put in conversation. So that is what I tried to do in this paper by braiding together Simon Forti's Huddle and Neo Sundare's poems from Neo Sundare's Horses of Memory. So in this paper, I probe the concept of kinesthetic awareness in Simon Forti's Huddle and assess how a similar aesthetic practice is echoed in Neo Sundare's Horses of Memory. By braiding together Forti's dance construction and Osundare's poem, I consider how kinesthetic politics functions in both texts as an organizing principle that connects individual bodies in contact into condensed affective formations. I argue that the body in motion as conceptualized by Forti in Huddle and Osundare in Horses of Memory becomes a signifier for inscribing the possibilities of subverting physical and social limitations that impose stasis. The staging of dramatic iterative intervention through kinetic action in both texts not only underscores the communal understanding of the self, but also instigates an awareness for an expression of embodied forms of knowledge available within the social spheres from which these works originate. Through this mode of reading, I highlight artistic parallels between both works and thus suggest an interdisciplinary mode of inquiry that amplifies our understanding of both texts. So a few comments on the idea of kinesthetic awareness or consciousness that I explore in this species. The word kinesthesia is derived from the Greek word for motion, kinesis, and aesthetics, and the word aesthetics meaning sensation. The kinesthetic sense is thus involved in the ability to feel movement of the limbs and body. First utilized to describe sensations activated by proprioceptors, the sensory organs that make humans aware of the interconnectedness of our body parts and the spaces that surround them. Kinesthesia as a concept in dance can be traced to research conducted in physiology and phenomenology in the late 19th century. So this concept has also been identified as arising from sensory stimulations via receptor muscles, tendons, joints, and the important point for me in utilizing a kind of kinesthetic reading of this text is the capacity of this frame to relate sensory systems, which then enable humans to experience position, movement, effort required to move the body. So I would then speak briefly about Simone Forti's Huddle. So Simone Forti is an American postmodernist artist, dancer, choreographer, and writer. And the piece that I examine in this paper is her piece Huddle, a dance construction that has been very popular in studies of postmodern dance movement. And she, in this piece, attempts to do something that I'm saying is finds its echoes in the kinds of aesthetic practices we find in Osundare's Horses of Memory. So this text that you see on the screen is an description of how huddle is to be performed. Again, like I said, it's a dance performance. So it requires people standing together, forming a huddle by bending forward, meshing into a strong structure. But this is narrative. So I am going to briefly show a scene in which huddle as a piece is performed. And then I will proceed from there. I hope this also works and we can make up with YouTube, but let's see. Oh, here we go. Can you still see my screen? The YouTube?
Yes.
No?
We can see your PowerPoint, but we don't see a video.
Okay, yes.
Okay, let's see if I can remedy that. This is actually a very short clip, but it's features Forti explaining an instance in which this dance construction was being performed.
My name is Simone Forti. We just did a piece on
Can you hear the sound?
the High Line, something I call a dance construction, because it's a dance, but it's also can be seen as a sculpture made of people. It's called Huddle. It's a piece that I made up when I was 25, back in 1961. I wanted to see something where you could watch people moving in a way that wasn't stylized, that you could just see what it was like to have somebody climb and to have people support that climbing and to watch people in action doing something kind of unusual.
Yeah, so you can find, this is a very popular piece, and you can find the extended video on YouTube, but I wanted to share that to give a clue of what I mean by this huddle dance construction that Forti has done, and it's being performed repeatedly in different artistic cycles. I will return to my PowerPoint. So Simone Forti's dance construction Huddle offers us an important aesthetic instance where we see kinesthetic politics in action. In his essay, Some Notes on Simone Forti, Robert Morris describes Fortis' foundational work in contemporary dance and art, describing Fortis' practice as a space where language, memory, and history mix in a kind of controlled and constrained movement that rings pathos from the understated. Another scholar, Wendy Perron, categorizes Fortis' work as an intersection of dance and visual arts that defies categorization because it brings together movement, visual tracing, verbal language, etc. So it is the intersectionality of Fortis' work that I argue affords itself to comparison with texts that have similar animating principles in other contexts. So this intersectionality is exemplified in Huddle and allows for a comparison of this piece with other artistic expressions that utilize language, image, and movement as a way of formulating thought and enacting a critique of society. Fortis' work is deeply concerned with the minutiae of movement and perception. And thinking about it in this way allows us to understand how the natural body as an expressive frame becomes a site for the performance of resistance to exclusion. Fortis dance construction is deemed a classic and has received a lot of critical attention. But the point which I'm making is that this text is yet to be placed in conversation side by side with other texts that have similar impulse, like, for example, the work of Ni Osundare. Fortis' subversion of dance conventions in Huddle allows her to explore dance as an interactive social unit that connects performers, the audience, and social nuances and embodied forms of knowledge, which both group participants bring into the field of performance. An essential component of Fortis' dance as interaction approach lies in her shift away from the single individual dancer to that of a group of performers whose ordinary or seemingly ordinary movements have a way of revolutionizing dance, as it were. By conceiving a sculpture that literally embodied movements as a viable means of artistic exploration, Fortis in Huddle proposes the values of movement for the body that are celebrated naturally and that also expresses instinctive creativity of the body in ways that were also considered revolutionary. So what I'm doing then is attempting to place Huddle in conversation with Horses of Memory, and in what follows, I will highlight a few poems from Horses of Memory that do this. And also for context, Ni Osundare is one of Africa's leading poets, dramatist, linguist, and literary critic. His poetry is influenced by the oral poetry of Yoruba people, which he hybridizes by infusing it with influences from other poetic traditions around the world, including African American culture, Latin American culture, Asian and European culture. Osundare's poems are rich in imagery, and as I argue in this paper, a certain intentional deployment of kinesthetic action. Some of his collections include Songs of the Marketplace, Village Voices, Moon Songs, The Word is an Egg, and others. And I'm also reading, how a similar impulse here functions in some of these other collections. Osundare's Horses of Memory employs a similar kinesthetic frame of reference similar to Simon Fortis' Huddle for exploring the dilemma of social interaction in his anthology, Horses of Memory. In poetry, kinesthetic imagery describes vivid physical actions or movements of characters and objects. Osundare uses this graphic technique to vibrantly etch scenes that appeal to the senses and imagination of his readers. Christopher Anyaku opines that in Osundare's poetry, sound is conceived as verbalized action employed to convey a class-conscious and people-oriented message which blends the oral resonances of Yoruba language and English. Osundare's approach to performative poetry owes its root to the centrality of performance in African oral literature. Ruth Finnegan, in her groundbreaking work, aptly captures the role of the oral artist as the source that the poet mimics in deftly using words in many senses, performing them and textualizing them, organizing them in time, altering them, inscribing them in written forms, and so on. In this context, then, kinesthetic awareness allows the poet to capture action via language, enacting his poems in a way that would allow the reader to envision the scenes and characters with an intensity of feeling and a depth of meaning. The capacity for integrating multimodal and multimedia aesthetic elements such as sound and movement contributes to the simultaneity of sensory impressions that Osundare captures in his poems. So beginning from the title of this collection, Horses of Memory, this title is an invocation of this idea that utilizes the metaphor of horses as a mode of transport through which the poet passes his musings down memory lane. As a writer on the quest to explore both his personal and communal histories, this journey into the past is redolent with kinesthetic images employed to describe social limitations that impose stasis. The collection is dedicated to the poet's father and is composed for, I quote, orchestration and an incantatory spectacle, part choric, part strenodic, designed to achieve full celebratory energy with the accompaniment of drumming and music. This is how the poet describes the scene of performance in which his poetry should be read. Arising from such dramatic impulses, this anthology can then be anything but static in its formulation and creative fervor. The collection's kinesthetic awareness is also visible in the subtitle of sections like long gallop, running kick, and soft canter, in each of these describing moments that one would witness in the race of a horse. In this segment, the reader journeys through different scenes from the poet's memoryscapes, witnessing and participating in his joys and sorrows, his lamentations and celebrations. Central to this dramatic iterative intervention is the use of kinesthetic action to underscore a communal understanding of the self, and as a means of conveying embodied forms of knowledge shared both by the poet and his audience. So we're going to see now, so these are basically the questions that I attempt to find answers to. And like I said, again, this is a work in progress, but I'm trying to think through how we can rethink kinesthetic undertones in Huddle and Horses of Memories as performing the connections of bodies into condensed affective formations. And we know there's a lot of interest in these kinds of affective readings of text, especially coming from the pandemic, where stasis was almost personified as part of daily experience, limitations, boundaries, and all of that. So to what extent can such thinking challenge the boundaries by evoking alternative challenge of movement that overcome both physical and social constrictions? What alternative forms of knowledge and meaning making and both perspectival and epistemological can attending to the world as inscribed in this text signify? So this is one of the poems in Osundare's Horses of Memory. And in this poem, a central image, this is the first poem of the collection. A central image of this poem is the figure of the farmer wielding his machete as a tool for agricultural cultivation. Using the expression, the machete is the man, as a refrain, this poem, an elegy for the poet's deceased father, takes the reader through the motions associated with farming activities that define the deceased life. Bush clearing, soil tilting, yam planting, etc. In an incantation of loss, the poet sings to the neglect of his father's farm, occasioned by the man's death. 1,000 seeds are sprouting, 1,000 tendrils are wandering. Where are the hands which mold their roots with ring of green moons? Where are the hands which piloted their journey up the stake of the stairs? They grope now, those tendrils. Oh, see how they grope, like a masquerade without a guide, like a snake beheaded in the armpits of the forest. So here we can see that by animating the plants through the use of kinesthetic idioms captured in words like sprouting, wandering, grouping, which are repeatedly mentioned, Osundare captures the disarray of a farm abandoned by its owner. Combined with images that suggest confusion, like a masquerade without a guide, a snake beheaded, the poet underscores his sense of bereavement and privation using embodied kinesthetic terms that he certainly communicates to his audience. A similar predisposition is also found in another of his poems here, that he describes trying to look back at the past, or this assertion of history that is often the concern of many African writers. He says here, we are not yesterday's people. We are people whose roots reach down to the depths of the earth, the cactus which mark the savagery of the desert. We are the river flowing back and forth to spite the rapacity of the sea. We are a flowing people. So you see, even graphologically in the text, we see that attempt to capture movement as an aesthetic practice. So in conclusion here, Osundare's kinesthetic consciousness allows him to inscribe a particular sensibility that is often found in oral poetry, but it also allows him to utilize this idea of the body as the central frame upon which meaning is based in this text. So in conclusion, by examining how kinesthetic undertones have been utilized in Forty's Huddle and Osundare's Horses of Memory as techniques that connect individual bodies in contact into condensed affective formation, I have sought here to conduct an interdisciplinary reading practice that ascertains how elements manifested across artistic forms like poetry, dance, and performance can be read together. So Osundare's amplified use of embodied language to mourn his father, to summon the oral artist as a figure of cultural reassurance, and to critique post-colonial ills coincide with Forty's use of huddle to fulfill a kinesthetic impulse. And just a little vignette, Forty had explained, I could not get to that part in my paper, that the reason why she produced this dance construction was because she wanted to go on a hike and then fell sick and couldn't go. So this dance construction was an attempt to produce a certain enactment of that desire to move, which had been truncated. Despite the difference in social circumstance and creative germs in which these pieces are produced, both artists utilize kinesthetic politics as a performative dynamic for socially positioning people in their effort to create and allocate spatio-political space for enabling interaction and framing social action. Thus, in these pieces, the deliberate effort to highlight and engage social codes involving movement, perception, and interpersonal affective relationship and kinesthetic tropes consolidates into a creative practice that underscores a communal understanding of the self. So I will stop here and hope that we would have more opportunity to chat in the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Oh, we've already got a question. Oh, a question for me. Okay, I'll read it quickly, but if there are other questions, or I don't know, Hope or Tidifong, if you have questions for each other as well. They were just, yeah, such interesting papers.
I think you could go ahead with
okay.
Have that and then possibly move from there.
Sure. So the question says, I wonder if you're able to find other examples of literary fiction cartooned in Nigerian newspapers. I also wonder if in the Daily Times of the 60s there were columns dedicated to literary writing by Nigerians. And if so, how such instances of literary writing in newspapers might compare with the cartooning of Quincy's novel. Finally, if I've looked for intersections between Nigerian visual and literary culture in the 60s, such as photoplay adaptations of Nigerian and especially Yoruba drama, and the use of images to illustrate Nigerian literature of the time, such as Daniel Fagunwa's novels. Wow, thank you. That's such a generous question, and there's so much material in there. So I've certainly not seen any other examples of literary fiction cartooned, but I'm really intrigued by this, the fact that Jaguar Nana appeared in Spear. There were two magazines called Spear at around this time. There was Spear, this kind of Lagos lifestyle, sort of Nigerian lifestyle magazine, and then there was Spear, which was produced actually out of South Africa, but had large circulation across the African continent in the time, which was focused more on film things. But the Nigerian one clearly had the Daily Times' magazine clearly was serializing Jaguar Nana, and I'm kind of want to see like what else was in there, and I've not managed to find, like, there are very few microfilms of that magazine around, and so I need to kind of try and track them down and then see what was going on across, because they're also, even the microfilm copies that there are in quite, like, they're really sporadic, like they're just of a few issues. So I need to kind of do some traveling around to see if I can get a sense of the larger content of that magazine. So I've not yet, but I'm really intrigued to answer exactly that question myself through a bit more research. The Daily Times didn't seem to have columns dedicated to Nigerian writing, but what's interesting is that that Saturday High Life page did include quite a lot of reflection on popular culture and literary culture, and particularly popular culture. There was a whole, through the period that this sort of the Amusa Tango series is running, there's a lot of debate about fan clubs and different fan clubs that are being set up, and then there's discussions of fan clubs of pop music and people like Cliff Richard and so on. There's lots of discussion of that, lots of discussion of fashion, but also of music. So there's a huge, one of the things that's really interesting is Shango is a jazz musician, and in this kind of jazz band, and there's lots of discussion going on at the same time in Saturday High Life, and there are competitions for jazz musicians, and there are lots of discussion about music and kind of jazz music. So there's a really interesting sort of point of connection between the cartoon and the other, the kind of comic and the other material on those pages. So it's not that we see Nigerian writers on the whole writing for the newspapers, but there is that kind of cultural environment that the newspapers like Daily Times particularly are engaging with. And I think the Daily Times engage with it a bit more, is my impression, than things like the Express, because it doesn't have that same political sort of valence to it at this time in the 60s. So, and in terms of the intersections between Nigerian visual and literary culture more broadly, no, and I clearly really need to. So thank you for those suggestions, and particularly the suggestion of Daniel Faguno's novels. I'm going to write that down and follow up on that. So thank you very much. As I say, this is right at the start, so there's lots for me to do, but thank you very much. Yeah, I'm going to hand over to Hope and to Fong, who I'm sure I've got other sort of, there may well be questions for them, but also I'm sure I have other questions for each other too. I do as well for you if you don't. But can I start and ask you a question then maybe? So I was wondering, Tita Fong, if you could, and I'm sorry, I hope I'm saying that right, your name. Okay. So I was interested in the use of the first person plural in that second poem that you showed us, and how, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the multiplicity of bodies in the particular kinesthetics that you're identifying in 40 and yeah, and in the poetry as well. So rather than a singular kinesthetics, but this kind of social kind of multiple kinesthetics, and how that fits in.
Yes. So thank you for that question, and it's really spot on, because I think it points to the kinds of insights that can arise when we put these kinds of texts from seemingly disparate traditions, but which seems to have similar animating principles in conversation. So there's a ton of scholarship on 40, and it's argued that part of the influences that define her work was this desire, at least in the modernist, dance art film, to kind of displace the singular performance figure. In European art, be it the ballet, dance, or whatever, it's always that singular figure that takes the center stage. Every other person is part of the audience. And the audience in this case is not the kind of call and response audience that we find in African cultures. It is, those waiting on the wings, and the performer gets center stage, and there is very little in terms of interaction. So whether interaction in terms of speech or acting together to evolve the performance. So Fortis' work and a number of other modernist arts, dance constructions that were produced around this time tend to challenge that mode, to try to look at instances of the everyday and instances of action that is not couched as, grand, but still have this capacity to teach us, different things about affect, about identity, about social relationships. So in Huddle, for example, and this is why the piece is very popular, there is always that sense that it can very easily be put together. So you just have a group of people come together and just try to climb. And there is also I don't know whether to call it a democratic impulse, because the way Huddle is set up, there is no scripts about it. The piece that I showed is all the scripts. So you just climb, and when it appears that one person has gone over, another person, there is this affective communication happening within the group that signals, okay, it's time for another person to climb. I'm still trying to think through what this would tell us about, say, African, and I might be generalizing here, African cultures of social support and interaction, where climbing or upward mobility is often seen as something that happens very cohesively and organically. You help somebody up, the other person helps you up. But that takes me into the realm of like sociology that I'm not very rooted in, but I found that interesting. So in Horses of Memory, it's a text that I'm still reading, but a similar idea comes up. So you have bodies in motion, and it takes it a little bit even further. There was a question that Professor Adejumobi asked in the chat about, I'll just read it. He says, it seems to me that Fortis' work foregrounds the body in motion, while Osundare seems to animate more than human bodies and animates inanimate subjects such as plants as well. Wouldn't that suggest kinesthetic politics has perhaps a more expansive application in written literary culture than in live performance, where humans have to use the body? They cannot actually move objects or enable objects to move. That is such a good point, Professor. Thank you very much. And yes, so in written text, there is this, you can draw on all the affordances of language to be able to, imagine otherwise, imagine differently. And another layer to this is that in the worldview, in the Yoruba worldview that Osundare writes from, it's understood that, life is animated across human, more than human and non-human forms. So that a piece of stick is lying on the ground does not mean it's inanimate. It's considered to be an active participant in the communal ages. So I think you sense that in Osundare's poetry. This attempt to even go back in the past and animate a dead father because he is being invoked as a participant in the current piece of writing. So that is it. And I think too, that's a very correct point, that written literature allows that more expansive engagement, but performance, even in its ephemerality, is also effective. So it shows us something that we can then look again and again in written literature. So they in such a way kind of speak to each other. And thank you very much for those comments. I'm still trying to think through, but I find them very interesting. If I may ask a comment to Hope, and I was wondering what you would say about the spaces of trauma in Dangaremga's novel. Like, where does trauma happen? I know there's a lot of emphasis on the kitchen. It's either people are eating or people are being led, it's taught to the kitchen, all kinds of things. And then if you think of Nyasha's, eating disorder, all of that, I'm wondering, what would you make of the spaces where it seems very specific kinds of trauma is enacted? And what those kind of spaces would then tell us about how to read trauma differently from Karut's definition? But I found your work very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. Actually, I have a portion of my paper that I called, I think, double trauma, where I identify the traumas of the females in the novel different from or they have something else going on in addition to what everyone else experiences in the novel. So I acknowledge that, but I couldn't present everything. And yes, it's also similar to what I've analyzed. It's not a single event. A lot happens in the kitchen, and that homestead, the women seem to be the ones holding the homestead together. And even Yasha at some point disturbs a lot of things that makes other people to start thinking differently, start seeing things differently. So yes, there is more about women in the novel that I couldn't say everything. And then, even though Karut's model doesn't recognizes trauma as a single event, their experiences in the novel, their colonial experience, and then the women's trauma as not just as colonial subjects, but as women in the novel also, their double trauma. It's different from from Carol's description, but then she also acknowledges the wound of the mind. And that's one aspect of her definition that I hold on to, which is why I said, no, we don't have to completely discard her theory. We can, merge or,
I was wondering, Hope, whether you found other models that you brought Fanon into conversation there with Caruth, but I just wondered whether there were other models of trauma and thinking about trauma that you found that came from beyond that kind of European tradition that goes through Caruth and De Capra and Rothberg and so on, and yeah, how you saw them perhaps doing that meshing.
Yes, I saw some. I also mentioned some of them in the full paper. But yeah, I just wanted to focus on the grounds in which some post-colonial critics do not accept Carut's model and want to discard that model. They give their own definitions, and some of them are also exclusive. They are specific to their own context. So theirs too, I also would not accept theirs, some of them. And so that's why I'm suggesting, and of course there should be, or there could be other definitions. There won't be a single definition that captures everything and will be, but then like the last person I quoted, Michael Rothberg, said in literary studies, we can't make precise definitions or complete exactitude. So there is nuance there, and we just always have to, in each context, just appreciate the nuances there. Yeah. Let's see, there is a question for you.
Yes, it's actually a comment. Thank you very much for that. This is part of the reason. So this paper, in full disclosure, originated from a grad seminar that I had. I was it was necessary that I put art history, which is a field that I had taken the seminar in, with African literature in specific ways, and bringing it to this conference was an attempt to listen, and your comments are just incredible. This says, might you consider comparing Osundare's poetry to other kinds of live performances that problematize the challenge of representing the animation of inanimate objects, or engage that problematic, whether those performances are from Africa or elsewhere? Yes, yes, because I think that coming from a context where there is no such clear-cut binaries between the human animated, objective figure and the non-human, non-animated material object. There's a lot of very interesting research that's been going on in Yoruba studies, for example, where it is almost seen that there are instances of Yoruba practice, ritual practice, that seem to almost juxtapose the animate human and the inanimate object. So you go into a farm and you see a series of objects tied together, almost as an object lesson. So it is, you're being told essentially, if you steal from this farm, this inanimation that this object represents is going to impose itself on you. This is what you're going to become. So I find that your comment reminded me, of that, and how it seems too that literature finds a way of, providing that space where we can engage in those kinds of questions. And this is something that recurs across both African art and representation. But again, like Fortis work shows, like Western, and even in, Caribbean performance and all of that. So I'm told we have 5 minutes, but yes, thinking about this, and for me, why this is essential is that the focus on the thematic, right? Themes of social this and that often takes up so much air that we do not really have time to see ways in which this meta language that, seeps across different kinds of texts and provide an intertextual glue that links them together actually works. And that is the point where issue where I'm trying to examine more closely in my work. So I will think about how this problematic of animation, inanimation intersects, and reading in more of Osundare's poems, and even Soyinka's work, where this is also a similar problematic. But Professor Baxter, I was wondering, in looking at the pictures of the scene of the newspapers, there seems to be a certain cacophony happening. The comedy, is almost battling for attention with all these other modes, the business adverts and all of that. So I was wondering if you could speak to that. Would you say that informed the way in which the comedy was couched or was accepted? The tension that it would operate between itself and these other modes?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, and as you say, the kind of cacophony. And I suspect that part of what we're seeing when Okpako is doing things like having those floating heads is actually, these where it's just like a head on blank space, just like floating, and they're thinking it's got a thought bubble, or it's maybe got a speech, or sometimes it's just got an expression, there's not even text around it. And I suspect that part of that is actually trying to grab attention, having these really strange, like striking images within the strip, maybe partly kind of fighting, as you say, with everything else that's going on the page for attention. But also, most of the time, as I showed, it has this really unusual place, which is across that central page, which doesn't happen for any other cartoons and any other advertisements. So it because it's the centerfold, there's no break in the page, so it can have its image kind of right across that middle. And I think that again kind of draws your attention in, because it's doing something weird on just its position on the page is unusual compared to everything else you would see as you worked your way through the newspaper, where it would always be on one page or the other, and then all of a sudden there's this thing that's right in the middle. So yeah, I think it's placed, the way it's placed by the editors is partly in conversation with those things, but then also some of the work that Epoko does to create something rather unusual visually that doesn't look like Garth, say, or Buck Ryan is also a part of that. I think we're pretty much out of time. We've got more, really lovely comments from everybody. Thank you so much. It's been so lovely to hear your papers and to meet you both. I'm looking forward to. Hope, where is your paper published? Where is your article?
Okay, the school where I did my MA in Canada, Brock University, so they had a press, graduate student press. That was where I published it.
Cool.
And
okay.
Brock University Press, yeah.
Brock University Press. Just so we can try and find it, because I really want to read it. It sounds great. So thank you.
A similar work that I did, I think a segment of what this paper does is also published.
Oh, great.
I was trying to see if I could find the link to share, and I think I just found it. Let me see. Yes, so this one is also a deployment of Yoruba epistemology as a way of reading diasporic writing. So the link is in the chat. Oh no, not the right link. That is not the right link. So, but okay. I hope we are not kicked off immediately. Okay, so here's the link. But yeah, a similar issue here, there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions, Professor Adejumobi, and everyone for coming. And thanks for sharing your work, Professor Baxter. Hope it was nice to meet you. I hope it will be in conversation subsequently.
That would be great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.